Hello, everyone. Welcome back. In looking over this week's material and some of the database activities we'll be doing, it occurred to me that some people might benefit from a little bit more explanation on what exactly a database is and what it does in healthcare. So this short presentation will give you a high-level overview of what a database is, some key terms, and introduce you to the concepts of databases. And again, this is for our HIM 125 course, and we'll be talking about what a database exactly is and some finer points about database terminology, such as records, fields, and others. So what is a database? A database is an organized collection of data stored electronically for easy access, management, and updating. We use it throughout healthcare in terms of registries, right? If you wanted to map it back to a paper analogy, it's essentially a filing cabinet, except with relational database, everything's in tables, which we'll talk about. And you can link different sets of data from one table or another and come up with meaningful information. Some of the ways that we use it in healthcare that are important include number one, storing secure storage of patient information. Everything on electronic health record, you could think about it as an ultimate database on everything involving a patient. So it stores it securely. In a paper chart world, we always had to look for the paper chart, find it. More than one person wanted the chart at the same time, so you needed to move it back and forth between physical locations, and it was a big headache. The other thing that we are doing is it supports clinical decisions. Most EHR systems now allow you to have JAMA or journals from the American Gastroenterology Association or the American College of Surgeons embedded into your electronic health record. So when you come across a disease that you don't normally see, a provider can go out, look up the latest literature, and come up with better, more sound clinical decisions. And then related to this, it enables research and reporting. During COVID-19, or prior to COVID-19, I should say, it took typically 10 to 20 years to develop a vaccine. And because of this type of technology, we could link data, conclusions, and other things quickly, map the genome of the COVID-19 virus quicker, and then come up with a vaccine that much faster. And again, all this sits on top of electronic health record systems. So now we get into some fun stuff. Structured query language, a term that a lot of you have probably heard of, but don't really know exactly what it means. It's basically a programming language designed to manage and query or ask relational databases questions. And the role in HIM is it extracts data, manages data integrity, and it automates certain things such as audits, data updates, and others. So as we'll see later on this week, we'll use SQL to find patients with a specific diagnosis or who belong to a specific payer. Some key SQL commands include such things as select, where we retrieve specific data, insert, where we add a new patient record, update, modify, and remove. And the syntax would be select, and then the term from is the table, and then the field is the diagnosis field, and we just want to look at patients who have a diagnosis of diabetes. And you can kind of see an example here. In this graphic, we see select employee code from the employee table where the name in the employee is select from a specific county. And then we're joining another table, but we'll get into that later on in the course. So important when we're talking about this is typically when we select things, we're selecting things out of a field. And we'll take a look at what a field is when we do the SQL project here in this course. But it's basically a single piece of data that goes across all records or all patients, if you will. So if we were looking at a patient table, it would be an attribute. All patients have a first name, they all have a database. You can kind of think of this as being analogous to a column. So, an example, in an EHR system, we might have a patient ID in an EHR system. So that begs the question, what is a record? A record's a collection of related fields representing a single entity, like a patient. And in Excel, we can think of that as being analogous to a row. So if we were looking at a record of all my information on a row would be Rick Reardon, my date of birth, any diagnosis I have, and who my provider is. That would be what a record is. And then you can kind of see a schematic of it here. In this case, patient ID is the name of the field. Name is the name of the field, as is age, as is diagnosis. However, going across, Jane Doe has a name. She has a patient ID. She's 35 and she has asthma. Those are her attributes, if you will. So that everything relating to Jane Doe is a record. And again, this is where in HIM we get into such things as patient care analytics. There's all kinds of uses on this, social determinants of health. Those of you who've taken ICD-10-CM coding, there's certain ICD-10-CM codes, terms of patient status codes that deal with homelessness, food insecurity, housing insecurity, and hopefully we can capture this data, get these patients, and get them the services that they need. And again, databases, they're foundational to HIM data analytics. You may not need to know how to do all these programming concepts, but you have to understand what a field, a record, a query, and what SQL. And the key to better health in this digital day and age is to harness databases that lead to better decisions and improve patient care outcomes. I hope you found that useful. Please get back to me if you have any questions or concerns about this topic. We'll see you online. Bye now.